Yes, sir.
So what would you say to historians that have found that Christ was not even written about till hundreds of years after his death? And when he was first mentioned, he was mentioned by the Romans as Christus, which does not translate into the Son of God. It translates into the Anointed One. So they could just have been referring to him as a knowledgeable, wise prophet with good teaching.
Well, if that professor who says that is employed by a state university, that's embarrassing. Why? Because although that used to be taught 75 to 125 years ago on these campuses, archaeological finds and the discovery of the writings of the early church fathers have totally smashed that whole school of thought that taught that the Gospels were not written until a couple hundred years later. What do I mean? In 95 A.D., Clement, Bishop of Rome, wrote letters in which he quoted Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In 115 A.D., letters that we have discovered, written by Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, quote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In fact, due to archaeological finds of the letters of the early church fathers, all of the New Testament is written about in those letters at the end of the first century, in the early second century. So that whole school of thought that taught that the Gospels were not written till hundreds of years after the event of Christ is totally false. Not only that, sir, but we discovered the John Rylands manuscript, which is a fragment of the Gospel of John. It's located in the John Rylands Museum in Manchester, England. It is a fragment of the Gospel of John that is dated between 115 and 130 A.D. So I'm sorry. If you have a professor on this campus who's teaching that the Gospels were not written for hundreds of years after Christ, that is an embarrassment to this fine university.
So, if God was an all-loving God, loved his children, wanted us to hear his word and do things he wanted to do, why would he choose his son to go to basically the center of the world at that point that was the most illiterate? And I would consider that point of the world, that area of the world at that time, not very trustworthy and not very knowledgeable. Why would they send him? Why not send him to China? China had the printing press at that time. They had the technology to write out things with machines and be able to mass distribute. Why the Middle East?
Por lógica, Medio Oriente, aparte de que fue el pueblo escogido de Dios, Israel, que se encontraba en el Medio Oriente, principalmente sería porque, si nos situamos en el mapa, el Medio Oriente está justo en el punto medio entre Europa, entre Asia, entre África, y desde ahí puede desplegarse a todo el mundo. Claro, ¿por qué no elegir una zona que tenía la imprenta para poder imprimir los libros y poder distribuirlo mejor? En primer lugar, porque Israel fue el pueblo escogido de Dios. En segundo lugar, porque Dios prevé, no es que prevea, sino que puede ver todo lo que va a acontecer. Entonces, según su plan perfecto, como es soberano, puede decidir en qué momento, en qué lugar va a escoger, porque puede decidir qué va a ocurrir. Entonces, él lo que lo está haciendo es verlo desde una perspectiva humana, desde una perspectiva de que él está dentro del tiempo. Entonces, si eliges este punto y este lugar y este tiempo, ¿por qué no elegir uno para favorecerlo? Mejor. No es favorecerlo, Dios tiene todo hilado. Entonces, en cualquier punto, en cualquier lugar, va a acontecer lo que Él quiere, porque Él lo puede ver desde fuera del tiempo.
I do not know why, when God chose to become a human being, he chose to be born a Jew. Jesus in the Bible never revealed that. What it does reveal is that God chose Abraham to be the father of the Jewish nation, and he chose to bless the world, to offer salvation to the world through one of the descendants of Abraham, who happened to be born a Jew, Jesus of Nazareth. He lived in Palestine, that land bridge where Europe Asia, and Africa come together. And I find it fascinating that the center of Christianity has moved from Israel to Northern Africa, Alexandria, Egypt, up to Western Europe and Eastern Europe, over the United States. But today, the center of Christianity is not in the United States or Western Europe. It's in Africa, Asia, and South America, the Southern Hemisphere. So Jesus Christ is not for one race. He's for the whole world. And I love the way the center of Christianity has gone around the whole world. We're not talking about the Great White Way. We're not talking about the Great Jewish Way. We're talking about, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Does that make sense?
It does, but I also feel you answered my question, but at the same time you didn't. You said you didn't know why Jesus would decide to be born. Well, wasn't it really God who decided that Mary would birth Jesus? And if he did choose Abraham, why didn't he choose somebody else in a more literate part of the world, in a more knowledgeable part of the world? And also, another point I'd like to bring up is, let's say thousands of years ago, there were things that we could not explain then that we attributed to God. There are things we don't understand now that 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, what we do attribute to God, we won't anymore, and we'll have the science to back it up. What do you think about that?
Aquí pasa mucho que es un argumento de los ateos el hecho de que la ciencia está explicando cosas que antes dábamos por hecho que era Dios. Pero aquí existe el problema siguiente, que la ciencia no estudia el para qué o el origen de las cosas en un sentido más abstracto, más de cómo acontecieron, sino que estudian el por qué. ¿Por qué sucede esto? Pues esto sucede porque pasan una serie de cosas que dan esta causa. Existe una causa y un efecto. Eso lo estudia la ciencia. Claro, la religión, o mejor dicho, la teología, no estudia por qué acontecen las cosas, sino para qué y el motivo por el que se originaron. El hecho de intentar enfrentar la ciencia con Dios no tiene sentido porque la ciencia estudia aquello que ha creado Dios. Y Dios crea. La ciencia estudia lo creado. No tiene sentido enfrentarlo porque habrán respuestas que nunca va a responder la ciencia. Sí que va a responder el mecanismo o el por qué se originan, pero no van a responder el para qué se originó o el cómo se originó.
I agree with you. Human beings, too often, due to their ignorance in a particular area, have simply said God. Like, I hear thunder. I don't know scientifically what happened, so I just say that's God speaking. That has obviously happened. But what's fascinating is, when you read the Bible, when you read the Gospels, you will notice that not once is that done. Now, Christians have done that at times over the past 2,000 years. But when you read the source document, you will notice that the God of the gaps is never talked about. That's one of the reasons, sir, why I'm so grateful that if anybody says to you, science contradicts the Bible, they're wrong. Why? Because there's no science in the Bible. There's no biology, no chemistry, no physics, no geology, no astronomy, as scientific literature anywhere in that book. How fascinating that God saw to it that Abraham, Moses, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John did not take their own scientific view and force it into the text. There is no scientific description in the Bible. That is why when anybody says, oh, well, it's just a God of the gaps, and as science increases, God shrinks. Yeah, that's true for some people's thinking, but it certainly is not true of the Bible. Because there's no God of the gaps. There's no science that ancient science or modern day science could contradict. It's not in there. How fascinating. For instance, I'm very excited about the Big Bang. I'm very excited about the Big Bang for the same reason that Albert Einstein hated the Big Bang. And Albert Einstein intentionally made a mathematical error in order to disprove the Big Bang. Why? Because Einstein was a pantheist. And Einstein thought originally that nature is God. Einstein understood if the Big Bang is true, it means there is a creator. Because what the Big Bang is showing is nature is not eternal. Matter and energy are not eternal. There is a beginning. A mathematician discovered the fudge factor that Einstein put in his mathematical equation to disprove the Big Bang, and Einstein admitted it. He said, I did it because I don't like the philosophical, theological implications of the Big Bang, which is clearly, sorry fellas, the universe is not eternal. There is a beginning. Now, think carefully. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore, the universe has a cause. What is the most reasonable answer to the question, who or what caused the universe? And Arno Penzias, who got a Nobel Prize for discovering the Big Bang, said very clearly, it points to some type of intelligent mind, some type of God.
Aquí lo podemos ver claramente en Génesis 1, en el tercer versículo que dijo, Dios dijo, haya luz, y hubo luz. Es decir, podemos ver claramente imaginar, mejor dicho, que antes de que haya materia, antes de que haya tiempo, antes de que haya cualquier átomo, era todo oscuridad. Es decir, no puede haber luz si no hay materia, si no hay nada que alumbre un objeto celeste. La Biblia nos muestra claramente que fue Dios el que estaba fuera del tiempo y el que dijo que se haga la luz. Es decir, esa causa que se explica en el Big Bang, eso que hace que todo explote y aparezca, es ajena al tiempo y a la materia, y se llama Dios. Y además en Juan 1, cuando habla en el principio, en el versículo 3, dice, todo fue hecho por Él, y sin Él nada se hizo. Es decir, ya tenemos dos puntos en el Antiguo y el Nuevo Testamento en el que señalan de que el Big Bang fue creado por algo ajeno a la materia, algo que está fuera del universo. Es decir, como aquí se marca, si hay una creación, debe haber un creador, y la Biblia es clara. Antes de nada estuvo Él, y Él dijo que se haga la luz. Por Él fue todo hecho.
So you see, sir, science, hard science, does not contradict the Bible. Now, what happens if tomorrow science shows that the Big Bang did not occur? Well, that wouldn't wipe out my belief in God, but it definitely would wipe out that piece of evidence that we have today that there's got to be some type of God. And I'd follow it. I'd follow whatever the evidence points to.